Anyway, the EU summit in Brussels continues today without Theresa May. The remaining 27 leaders are due to discuss the future development of the European Union post-Brexit, because we're coming up to the anniversary of the Treaty of Rome, which is a big event for at least for the remaining 27. Our correspondent Ben Wright joins us now from Brussels. Ben, Mrs May's not there. I assume Brexit is not high up the discussions at the moment because Article 50 hasn't been triggered. So what are they talking about?
Well, I think there's party planning going on this morning. The 27 sitting around working out how this big event they're planning for the 25th in Italy is going to work, which they want to look like a huge show of unity by the European Union to mark 60 years since the Treaty of Rome was signed. So they'll be talking about that today. They'll be talking about recent plans put forward by the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker for the 10-year plan, various options for the future direction of the EU. And I imagine too, to be in that room, they will probably be talking about Brexit. Now, of course, they're not talking about negotiations in public. They won't do that until Article 50 is triggered. But once Theresa May does that, once she writes her letter to the European Council, then the EU 27 then have to work out their negotiating mandate, how they're going to approach these talks. And those talks have been going on behind the scenes, and I'm sure they're touching on it this morning.
Is there a sense, are you covering a Marie Antoinette moment there as they all talk about a party behind you? And Geert Wilders is ahead in the polls in Holland. He's against the EU on the hard right. Marine Le Pen is doing far better than her father, will almost certainly be in the second round of the French elections. And 4 out of the 5 biggest parties in Italy are now against the euro. Did they ever think about any of that?
Well, throw Trump into the mix as well. The great American ally of the EU, the US, has gone decidedly wobbly since Donald Trump entered the White House. There are existential challenges to the European Union wherever you look.
But they're talking about a party.
But you don't. I think they've got to get the tone of this party quite right, which is why they don't want Theresa May to trigger Brexit in the immediate days before or the immediate days after this big event in Rome, and that has been made quite clear to the British government. Look, they know that this is a very difficult time for the European Union. There is no getting around that at all. And that is going to colour their approach to Brexit. You do hear a lot, people around here saying it's all very well for the UK to keep saying we're going to get the best deal for Britain. People here are saying we're going to get the best deal for the European Union, and one that acts as a warning to others not to leave the club. And,
right.
In the absence of specifics about what the European Union are going to put on the table and how they're going to approach it, that's what we have to go on.
But we don't know if there's agreement among the 27 about what the best deal for the remaining European Union would mean. We don't know if the polls agree with the French. In fact, we're pretty sure they don't. We don't know what Mr. Macron's idea of a good deal would be, or Mr. Schulz's idea if he was to become the Chancellor. The Nordics have a different view from the Club Med countries. I don't know what a good deal would look like for all 27 to agree on.
You're absolutely right. You also hear that Germany is certainly trying to restrain countries who want this to be a sort of a process of punishment for the UK. The Germans are very worried about what might happen to the City of London if there is a sort of a punitive approach taken on the question of financial services, for instance. But you're right. Each country too has different interests, which is why there is a suspicion here that the that the UK may try and divide and rule a bit when negotiations begin. And I think the EU is very aware of that, and at the moment is stressing that they are going to go into this as one united bloc. And certainly after the Malta summit, all EU leaders were stressing that they will be negotiating as a bloc, and the UK will not be able to peel off individual countries by playing to individual interests.
I want to ask you one final thing, Ben Wright, and it comes out of that of trying to negotiate as a bloc, because some in the British government here are saying that once Article 50 is triggered, a deal, not much will happen because of all the elections that I mentioned to you, but a deal on reciprocal rights will be done quickly for EU nationals here and UK nationals in the rest of the EU. And that will partly be done to keep Eastern Europe on board. And that they do think that that will happen quickly, but then there'll be a hiatus as the French elections get underway, followed by the others. Is there any indication of that where you are, that the EU may be on board for this too?
Look, not in concrete terms, but I think it would make sense. I think there is an eagerness clearly in the UK to get this done, and they weren't prepared to concede it outside the formal negotiations. And I think the feeling is within the EU that the same approach has to be taken. So it could well be that that is taken off the table quickly, and then the EU knuckles down and works out how it's prepared to negotiate. But you're right, there will be. I think we can expect a lag until proper negotiations actually begin. We've got to get those elections out of the way first, which is why I don't think we're talking about proper talk starting until it feels like summer, actually. And then a big question is, there is a tussle going on here between the Council, the leaders, and the Commission about the priorities. And certainly it's my feeling that the Commission, led by Michel Barnier, want this issue around money sorted very early on. They think there is this bill, the numbers are disputed, 50 billion perhaps, that needs to be settled first before you can move on to other aspects of this negotiation, including possible parallel talks on a transitional trade agreement. Now, what's going to be fascinating over the next few weeks is trying to work out who's winning that fight between the institutions of the European Union as they approach this negotiation.
Ben Wright, thank you very much. It's been very good to talk to you. Ben Wright in Brussels there. And Ben finishes there on what is going to be putting the EU reciprocal rights issue to one side. And as I say, the British government is increasingly confident it can do quite a quick deal on that, but then nothing else. There is then that being, oh, we've done that. On the other hand, this demand from the Europeans saying you've got to settle the Brexit divorce bill first before we talk about free trade. If you speak to our government, that's a deal breaker. They're not going to do that. They want the two things to go in parallel.
It is. They want them done at exactly the same time. There's no way in which the British government is going to get itself into a situation where it says, OK, how much do you want? 60, call it 30, settle on 45, here's a large cheque, now let's talk about the future terms. It's an absolute non-starter. I think it's one of the reasons that the government has started talking in much blunter terms about no deal being better than a bad deal and preparing people for the possibility of hard Brexit. The reality is, which Ben's analysis illustrated, is that if it was a question of a straightforward deal between Germany and the UK, that's not straightforward, but much easier to envisage how such a deal could be concluded. Germans are terrified of the Eurozone being disrupted. The Eurozone debt machine, 75% of it, is run out of London. So they want the city, they essentially don't want the Eurozone settlement disturbed, at least not in the short term for all the hype. But it becomes apparent from what the European Parliament is saying that even if you get a deal like that done, and Germany and Britain, the two largest contributors, agree, well, it then could go to the European Parliament and be voted down. So I think the government are very deliberately, consciously just preparing people for the possibility of chaos on the continent and a deal, even if it's agreed, then somehow being vetoed.
So the way ahead is as clear as mud.
Yes, and we had Torsten saying that life and politics are complicated. Well, we haven't seen anything yet, with the interests of all the institutions and the 27 nations all quarrelling with one another. And of course, the problem with the Brits is that if we turn around to the EU and say we're not interested in settling your bill, much of which is for the pensions of people, Brits who've worked in the EU, and much of it is also for the costs of ongoing EU programmes in Britain, which aren't going to wrap up overnight.
Yeah, but that you could deal with.
But
we don't know what the cost of the
settlement
pensions is, and it's going to be politically very difficult for a British government to agree to a massive bill for pensions for EU bureaucrats whose pensions are 3 times average wages in Britain.
I'm not saying it's not difficult, but the point is that if you're Britain and you're standing firm and you're saying, no, we're not going to cooperate, then the one thing that you need from these 27 nations is the feeling that we are not just an almighty irritant that is delaying everything they want to do with the EU over the next couple of years.
But that's the reason we're going out.
And I think it is accepted that there will have to be a settlement. But the question is in what order it happens. And what's impossible to envisage is the government paying the money before it has any indication what the deal
because the money
like.
will become a surrogate payment for access
Precisely.
to the single market. Yeah. That's how it'll be done.
And there's a very big difference between a single one-off payment, say 35 billion, which is about 3-4 years contributions from the UK, settles all of what you describe, and some other programmes which we had agreed to before the referendum. Big difference between that and then an ongoing payments. I think that is probably, year after year, payments are something that Tory backbenchers would not stomach.
Plenty coming up.